just ask you to kind of hold your questions till the end. I know Mr. Waters may chime in as, I'm presenting with some of our peers here, and then we'll try to get through the presentation and then, field some, questions from you all at the end. So next slide. So this will be the agenda. I'll introduce our finance team, talk a little bit about our current financial position, which is positive, our project budget and the long-term financial planning model, behind it, our fiscal responsibility and regulatory guidelines that we have to follow, and that's where I'll hit on Act 34 a little bit that Mr. Floro talked about earlier. And then I'll have our folks from PFM talk a little bit about, what that current model might look like, understanding that it may change relative to market conditions and timing of when we need money, but we'll go through that. And then we'll talk at the end about that taxpayer impact. Specifically for the project, as you know, we've shared, publicly shared all that data as to what our long-term, taxation plans look like for both the high school project and our operational needs driving out over the next 5 years, and I'll touch on that a little bit as well. So next slide. So this is our finance team. So I do have Zach Willier here from PFM, and his partner Garrett Moore works behind the scenes with us to make sure that we're watching the market and things that are happening and aligning it to what our project team is doing. Our bond underwriter team from Janney Montgomery Scott, Tim Friends is here, been with the district for a while, as well as our bond counsel from Discipline Schulman. Christopher Brewer is here, just to help field questions at the end if needed. And of course, myself and Mr. Waters, and somebody I didn't put on a slide that actually does all the work, Ms. Brooke Baker, to the right. So go ahead, Karen. So, just on our current financial position, and you'll see some of this as, that we do talk about, the strength that, that we have, and, we're in a good financial position, to assume this future debt, due to balanced budgets, our current reserves that we have in place, and we'll talk about the timely restructuring and financing the debt and what this team, has done over the past 7-8 years. But we do have a high quality credit rating from Moody's, AA2, which helps us secure good rates in the market. Our independent annual audit reports, which we will, which I am hopeful, Brooke and I are working on now for this year, but we have had positive results there as far as our fiscal management and planning, tools that we use. And the capital projects fund that we talk about often, the current balance there is 13.1. We're gonna talk about, utilization of that for the high school project and how we've been planning that. You will see in the fall, we're gonna add to that balance too through some positive operations that we've talked for 22-23. So all of that will tie into, how we make this all happen. And just a footnote, the borrowing capacity and tax base have grown since 2016. So if you go way back to when we started those discussions, we did talk, and I'm gonna talk about some regulatory requirements. We certainly did not have the borrowing capacity or ability under, Act 1, to do the project, without voter approval or referendum approval, and I'll talk about all of those things here shortly. But go ahead to the next slide, Karen. So one of the things that put us in a good position relative to our debt is the timing of the market and the refinancing of existing debt. So from 14, 15, 16, and 2020, our team, saved the district over $8 million in future debt payments. So we, not only have we retired debt since 2016 in our annual operating budget by the debt service payment, but we've restructured and refinanced debt as well to put us in a good position. The current outstanding debt is 47.7. That'll tie into, when we talk about, kind of that borrowing base capacity in a little bit. So next slide, Karen. So we did talk about that project budget being in that range and that maximum, project cost that was set by Act 34. And just a preliminary note on Act 34 is this is kind of the preliminary phase of that with the action item that the board will approve next week. We will have, an Act 34 booklet that describes the project, talks about those maximum costs, and an Act 34 hearing, which is required, which is set for October 26th, to talk about those things. But, I'm here to say, okay, well, if it is that $105 million, how are we gonna pay for it? And similar to, how we've explained that before, we are gonna do it through issuing long-term financing bonds and, spread that repayment out over a period of time, similar to what you would do with your mortgage. You take it out for 30 years and you do that and looking at that. So, and that's what we did for the other big project renovations that we did at the middle school and elementary schools. We'll initiate those borrowings when favorable to the market conditions and when we need the funds. I mean, we'll be aligning all this to the actual project schedule and those cash flow needs, but also looking at the market, similar to as a homeowner, when you're shopping mortgage rates. I mean, that's what we're gonna be doing, and that's what some of these folks do, for us as we do it, and use our strong credit to, sell those bonds in the market. And I'll talk a little bit about, in phasing those borrowing and millage over multiple years to ease the impact to taxpayers. And this is nothing new, we've had that long-term plan and put some of this out that will clearly show that impact just for this high school project, here today. So next slide, Karen. And this is nothing new either. So you've seen this in April. I just wanted to make sure that, we had this in there. So part of our long-term planning is, okay, how are we paying for everything? We talked about the capital planning and that $13 million budget, and we have long-term plans to address all the needs of all of our facilities, including the new high school project. But from an operational budget, we talked about this debt service line, and you'll see where this ties into our presentation. But over the next 5 years, our intent is to build up into that, what that projected debt service, might look like for that mortgage that we're gonna take out, on the high school project. And we've been doing that in those, 2 lines of debt service and fund transfers. And, some of the other things just to note in here are, we also include, what we'll refer to as indirect costs. So it's in the act, we've been saying it, hey, yes, there's additional salary and benefits in there. We're gonna need a couple additional, maintenance and custodial folks, cafeteria worker. We're gonna have some increased utility costs relative to the new building, and what it might be for facilities. Transportation, although minimal, we do have some, some projected costs in there for that, for transporting kids down the hill to, to the, field here. Even though we're not sure that we'll have to do that because we can use our current routes, we're just making sure we cover all bases. So that's kind of that long-term planning model from an expense standpoint. Next slide. And you'll remember we went over all of the, these in April, but they are pertinent to what we're talking about tonight. So the revenues, okay, how do we pay for that? And these are the projected revenues to meet those that obviously do require a tax increase in there. So highlighted up at the top that we've talked about is, what we did in 23-24. We did have a 2.9% tax increase. And are projecting similar tax increases for the next 4 years till the end. And I'll outline that more, but wanted to show the connectivity between the revenues and expenditures, at this point for that. Next slide, Karen. So we talked about that fiscal responsibility and regulatory guidelines. So these are the things that we've talked about frequently. Hey, Act 1, you can't tax too much. Local Government Unit Debt Act, you can't borrow too much. Act 34, you can't spend too much, you can't build too much. So I'm gonna go through all of those, but we've said all along that we intend to stay under those, under those regulatory constraints. And yes, a voter approval via referendum, and I know, we had comments about that earlier, that is true. If we go over those, there would be a referendum, if we exceed any of these limitations, and we're, planning to stay within them. Next slide. So the first one is Taxpayer Relief Act. So this is where there's a limit on the annual operational budget tax increase. So for 23-24, you'll recall it was 4.1%. We raised, our tax increase was 2.9 under there. The future rate projections, next 3 years, 5, 4.3, and 4. That's what the Act 1 is. It is projected to increase that. But the next slide shows that a little more. Next slide, Karen. And we presented this when we, talk about the budget in those long terms, and we've really isolated it now to those 5 years. And this is kind of a long look at, the history of the taxing, tax in Quaker Valley. So, you know, the blocks of time since Act One became law, is you'll see that we've consistently stayed under that cost of living index. In fact, our average tax increase for the 6 years, you know, prior to the reassessment and the 9 years after, you know, was around 2%. So, you know, I refer to that as, hey, there's always been, because of our need, you know, our reliance on local taxes. Mr. Waters explained how 75% comes from, you know, those two local taxing sources. You know, it's, you know, unfortunate that, you know, we have to cover, you know, cost of living increases with those taxes. Net operational increases averaged about 2% each year. And we've said that, you know, obviously with this, the largest capital investment this district is gonna have for the next 100 years probably, right? You know, there's obviously gonna be an incremental increase to that. And so what we've been predicting in this model is that those tax increases of the 2.9, 3.4s, you know, they'll average 3.1%. So although higher than our, you know, what our typical operational need is, they are well within, you know, the Act One limits. So you'll see we consistently stayed in those blocks of time under those limits, and we're predicting to stay way under this limit of Act One, even further under the limit of Act One, even during this 5 years than we have in the past when you look at those differentials. So,
Scott, can I interject with a
Yes.
question? This is Jeff Waters for those on the phone. We have visibility to at least some actual tax increases, historical tax increases by our cohort, our academic cohort. Can you comment on your understanding of how those have trended versus QV, just directionally? Have we been ahead of them, behind them, or about on pace? And then I know this is a bit crystal ballish. I mean, it's crystal ballish enough for us to project out our annual projected tax increase expectation. But I'm gonna ask you to try to do that kind of in aggregate for that same cohort, as you know where they've been and you kind of have a sense of where they might be headed, they being our cohort. Can you give us a sense of how we benchmark both in actuality through historicals, as well as what we should expect the comparison to look like moving forward? And I'll put the exclamation point on it. I think there's a belief in the community that we are overtaxing relative to our cohort, and I'm not sure the fact set would support that.
well, we do, when we do our budget presentations, you'll all recall, like, we do show the graphic, right? Of, you know, that our tax rate is in the bottom 25%, you know, of Allegheny, you know, County school districts. So, but that cohort in this movement that I said showed that was 2%, yeah, we're right in line with that. I mean, they may be slightly lower, 1.8, because we have a higher reliance on taxes, but remember that 2% for us at a lower tax rate, I would consider them very equal. You know, so looking out, because we're not elevated as much in our long-term projections, you know, although I think we'll probably move a couple notches up on that checkerboard, you know, I can assuredly tell you we'll still be in the bottom tier, you know, of taxation even after, you know, the 5 years, you know. And that is, and we always talk about, you know, to expand on that, I mean, we do always talk about the value, you know, the value of Quaker Valley for the, you know, for the tax rate and that QV difference that goes along with it, you know, too. So understanding it's a tough balance with taxes, but, you know, could also tell you when folks are, you know, when we ask folks, why are they moving into the district, the number one thing they say is the school. And so that investment, you know, that investment is reflected in the rates and what we do.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide. So that's how we stay under Act One. The next one is the Local Government Unit Debt Act. So this is that borrowing base, you know, so that you can't borrow too much. So they put parameters in there because, quite frankly, folks used to just build whatever the heck they wanted to. So the laws kind of restrict you to do that, is to, you know, how much you can borrow. And it's based on your 3 average year revenues. Next slide, Karen. And, you know, so this is, and you'll recall this from April as well. So and it's updated just for current for this kind of 5-year, you know, total. So you'll see, you know, what our revenue projections are and how that calculates out a borrowing base of $125 million. Our current outstanding debt is $47 million. So we currently have capacity as of today, you know, to borrow $78 million. And you'll see the progression as that modeling goes out, we pay down debt and the revenue source that, you know, that number in 26, 27, when we're looking at a 2027 opening for this school, you know, certainly could fund the $105 million project. Now, we're gonna talk in next slides, that we're probably not gonna borrow 105, but that shows the capacity and how we're staying under that limitation. Next slide. So the last one, which was the action item tonight, is Act 34, you know, which they refer to as the Taj Mahal Act. So again, so you're not, you know, building a Taj Mahal, you can't spend too much on the building. And it doesn't matter where the money comes from. So it doesn't matter if somebody gave you a check for $100 million, you gotta follow this process, okay? So the numbers in the project, you know, costs and the maximums that you approved today, it's part of, you know, John Thomas and the team's estimates that we work with. So you'll recall in May, we went through those estimates. They were roughly over $98 million at that time. Act 34, it's a prescriptive process from the state. You know, so it takes the estimates, it, you know, puts in other things like, you know, borrowing costs and contingencies, and it kind of builds that modeling, you know, for it to get the maximum project costs. The other thing it does is it creates another calculation for what's called, jump to the next slide, Karen, and I'll go back. It also does a calculation of the aggregate building expenditure standard, you know, as well. So when Mr. Floro pointed out these two numbers, 72 and 105, it does be like, wow, you can only spend so much on the building, and then here's what the site is, and it excludes site, and it's real prescriptive. You follow their processes to, you know, as to what that is. But that aggregate building expenditure standard is a calculation based on, you know, what the utilization of the building could be and the capacities and things of that nature. All of that's gonna be described in the Act 34 hearing, and it gets to this number, and that number, you know, as far as what that building cost can be, we're estimating it's gonna be around 80 million, and you'll see all that in there, you know. So right now, our estimates, you know, driving a 72 number are under that, you know, $80 million number. Karen, flip back a slide just so I didn't miss any big bullet points. That's where I'm talking about the calculations based on per pupil, you know, spending, and, you know, this is applicable regardless of whether, you know, the project is reimbursable, which we don't think there's gonna be the state. Go ahead, Karen. And, slide one more. Is it frozen?
It is. Yes, hold on. Goodness gracious. There we go.
Okay, and as I said, that Act 34, you know, hearing date will be October 26th for that. So the next part is, go ahead one more slide. So we'll talk a little bit about what that model may be, and I'm gonna ask Zach Willier, PFM, to come up here with me. He'll go through a little bit, but just reminding you, that's what we're looking at. How are we gonna pay for it if it hits the maximum of 105? And he's gonna talk a little bit about some of what the current market looks like, how we might spread that debt over, and how we layer it in, and I'll close with kind of that millage impact. Zach?
Okay. Thank you, Scott. So, Zach Williard, PFM. So I'm gonna walk through the next 3 slides. Okay, it's gonna talk about the borrowing and how we're gonna phase in the debt, tie in some of the numbers that Scott keeps talking about. You know, as Scott mentioned, your underwriter and your bond counsel here, this is always a team effort. I mean, there's a lot of behind the scenes back and forth with Scott on running scenarios, interest rates. You know, one thing everybody knows the last couple of years is interest rates have been going up, right? So if we flip to the next page, let's give a little market update. So when you hear about interest rates, typically you're hearing about the Fed funds rate, right, which is going up. And even if you don't pay attention to the financial news, you still hear that in the periphery. That's true, but that's not where we borrow from, right? That's a short-term overnight rate. When you're gonna borrow for 20 or 30 years, you're gonna use a different index, okay? The index that most people follow in the world is the Treasury bond, right? So a 10-year Treasury bond is something that investors look at, that people that trade stocks look at. It just gives you a general gauge of the market. What we look at is this chart, which is called the MMD index. So this is the 10-year Treasury, but it's the tax-exempt version because you can borrow tax-exempt as a school district. And so what we look at here is When you look at the bottom half of the chart, this goes back to January of 2022. You can see interest rates kind of have gone, basically up since the all-time lows of COVID, right? So it does look a little scary, okay, rates have been going up. But then when you look at the top chart, you can see, well, really where interest rates are is they're back to 20 and 30-year averages. We still see borrowings every week in Pennsylvania where schools are borrowing in the 4% range when they go issue debt similar to what you would do. So I just want to make the point that, well, we keep hearing that, interest rates are going up and up and up, and they are, right? It's not quite tied to that Fed funds rate that everybody follows. It's a different index. This is the MMB, and, rates are not bad. They're just off all-time lows, all right? So let's skip to the next page. So this is probably small if you're looking up here, but if everybody has it in front of them. So this is a page that, you've seen going back to January, June of 2020, I think was the first time that we went through this page. But this is the comprehensive financing plan. There's been many versions of this. This is the latest and greatest update, all right? So first, let's start with column 11. So column 11 says gross debt post issue. So this is where your debt is today. So if you do nothing, your debt payments in column 11 will look like they do here, okay? And you'll see they kind of trail down from 6 million down to 4 million, and then they tail off, out in 2045 with a few $100,000 payments. It's important to note the structure of that debt, because unlike when you do a mortgage or a car loan with municipal debt, there's different structures that you can use to minimize the impact of taxpayers, okay? And what that's called is a wraparound debt structure. So when you look at columns 12, 13, and 14, you'll notice a couple things. One is, each of these is a 30-year borrowing. Very typical for a school district in Pennsylvania and around the country. When you're building a new building, you issue it over 30 years. The useful life of the building will be even greater than that. But this, gives the minimal kind of impact to the taxpayer and the upfront budget. And you'll notice when you look down the payments, there's smaller payments up front, and then they start to ramp up as your existing debt pays off. So just following the blue column, you can see you have smaller payments, and once column 11 starts to shrink, you can see column 12 starts to increase, right? Because you take the different debt issues that the district has, and they kind of piece them all together into a puzzle. What you see in your budget every year is one line item for debt service, right? And the bogey for this project for debt service that you'll see in your budget is $8,365,000. So what we're doing is we're taking columns 12, 13, and 14, we're structuring them in a specific manner to make sure that we can, don't go above that $8,365,000 with the use of these different tools that we have, all right? So then when you look at the last column there, column 15, that shows what your payments will be going into the future. So when you fund $8,365,000 in your debt service line item, which Scott showed on a different slide earlier, that's going to be enough to fund the project kind of through the life of the debt, okay? Now, if we look at the top boxes, just to tie some more of Scott's numbers back, so what this is showing here is that we're going to borrow about $94 million for the projects. The exact amount on this page, which will change, is $94,991,000, okay? Right below that, there's a line item for district cash and interest earnings, right? So there's going to be some portion, as Scott mentioned, I think there's about 13,000 available. There's going to be some portion of that that's available for the project that we will use to borrow less money, and it'll just depend on how things go. The other variable is interest earnings. So when we talked about the Fed funds rate going up, that's actually good for your interest earnings. So when we borrow this money, so let's talk about the blue one again. When we borrow this money in September of 24, that's going to be put into a construction fund that's going to earn interest at market rates. Right now, you're earning about 5% on that money. As we go through the process and as we go through the construction schedule, you're going to be earning interest the whole time on the borrowed money. Then at the end of the project, when we go to issue the last borrowing, we'll know how much you've earned over that time, and then we will shrink the borrowing subsequently to match what the interest earnings were. So if you earned $1 million of interest, we'll borrow $1 million less than that last borrow. Now again, I'm using kind of basic numbers, but it's something like that will happen. Again, all these tools are just designed to get you the lowest overall cost for the project.
And just to chime in here real quick, Zach, on that, so what he's saying is that district cash and interest earnings is, some will be interest earnings and the biggest portion is gonna be that funding from our capital plan.
Yep.
You know, in our capital reserve fund, you know, where we have it, so that's the $13 million that we have. As I said, we'll be adding to that this year, and if you go back to the long-term financial planning, you'll see dedicated transfers to ensure, you know, that capital funding plan is fully funded for all of our buildings and meets that objective of paying for some of the cash.
And then the last column there, column 16, that's where we just take the millage equivalent of what this new debt service looks like, right? So you're gonna be moving from debt service payments, you know, about $6.4 million up to $8,365,000, and that's equivalent to approximately 1.16 mils. Again, give or take where interest rates are when we issue the debt. That would be the impact of the project on the borrowing side. And as Scott mentioned, he's gonna walk through, you know, some of the other operational increases to millage, but that's essentially what the borrowing plan is. And again, we're doing this in 3 tranches. You know, that could change a little bit depending on timing. Right now, that's what we expect to happen. We'll hit the market at different times, right? So it hedges your interest rate risk. We always knew that we wouldn't issue this all at once in order to phase it into the budget and to hedge interest rate risk over a period of time. So right now, you know, this is where the plan stands. Questions?
Zach, Jeff Waters,
Yes,
can you
sir.
just comment on the degree of rate risk you see inherent in this model exercise,
Sure, good
either
question.
upside or downside?
So when you look at this page compared to other versions we've done going back to, you know, 2020, you'll notice that it doesn't look a whole lot different, even though interest rates, as we showed you on that chart, have changed dramatically. And that's because, you know, if you go back 1, 2, 3 years, we were always assuming what's called an interest rate spread, right? So when the district prices bonds, you know, every single maturity for 30 years has its own interest rate, its own fixed interest rate. And you trade off a spread. Your AA2 credit rating, okay, you're not gonna get an interest rate that's exactly what that interest rate chart we showed you before. You're gonna get something like that rate plus a spread. So when you look at the bottom, there's a little footnote that says, we're assuming an interest rate, August 16th MMD plus 75 basis points. So 1 basis point is 1/100%. So right now we're saying that if Quaker Valley did a transaction in today's market, it would price off the interest rates today plus 75, 0.75%. And then we added an additional 0.5% onto that for these interest rates. When you go back and look at older ones, we were doing market rates as of that time period, but we were adding 150 to 200 basis points of cushion because, again, we knew we were at all-time lows. And we knew we weren't issuing the debt yet, and we would do it over multiple tranches over many years. So we built in pretty significant cushion. Now we did chew up most, or if not all of that cushion. So right now, instead of saying that, you know, we're gonna issue this debt at plus 200, we're saying it's plus 50. You know, we think we're kind of at whatever the new normal is with interest rates. I mean, no one really knows where interest rates will be. So, you know, this is, you know, the conservative estimate now is today's market plus 0.5%. Does that answer your question? Okay, so the last page, believe it or not, it's even smaller than that. We're not gonna go through all these numbers. A couple highlights here. So Scott kept talking about, you know, the different terminology. There's Act 34, there's borrowing base. So this is the way we look at your borrowing base and your borrowing capacity. But really this page, it looks confusing. It's not as confusing as it looks. So what the state law prescribes is you have to look at the last 3 years of revenue that the district had, then you multiply it by 225%. Okay, so that's where that gets you is line B, which is this gray bar up here. Okay, so that's your debt limit, right? That's what the state says your debt limit is. Then what you do is you subtract out the debt you already have issued. And so what we're doing here is we're subtracting out the outstanding debt that you have and the outstanding debt that we predict to be coming online. So when you look at row D, which is this one here, that gray bar, it shows you year by year what your debt capacity is. And as Scott said, when you looked at this a couple years ago, you could borrow, 50 million, 63 million, 71 million. As revenues typically increase and as the debt pays off, the existing debt, you can see your borrowing capacity goes up And then we start to issue the new debt around column 6, budget year 24-25, you'll see your debt capacity drop from 86 million to 44 million. Well, that's because we just issued the first phase of the project. And then the same thing the following year, you can see the debt capacity drops down to 16 million, which right now is about the low. And that's because the new debt is coming online. Once that debt's issued, then you continue to pay off debt, and you'll see, you know, in theory, if you do nothing else, the borrowing base then starts to rise again. So this is one of the pieces of the puzzle that we have to follow, and this is the state law and how we kind of view it. I don't know if you've been into
Yeah,
that.
I mean, you know, what I would add is, and I'd point out on the other slide, if we could do the whole 105 million, actually with Zach showing here in those numbers, we actually could do more than 105 for this particular piece. You know, now we're not going to, you know, because we don't want to pressure test Act 1 and, you know, certainly have to follow the Act 34 requirements, but we're well within, you know, what the financial, you know, world put as a cap on for, you know, borrowing based on our strength and revenues.
Yep.
Thanks, Zach.
Okay, great, thank you.
Well, there may be more questions at the end, so
Sure.
you may not be off the
So
hook.
can you email us all of this, cause it's really hard for us.
Yeah, it's posted.
It
Oh,
will
it
be,
is?
it will be.
It
I'm
will
sorry,
be
I thought
posted.
everybody had this in front of them, my apologies.
Oh, no, it's fine. Thank you for the
You
explanation.
can't see that? You need more carrots.
Oh, no, it's okay, I'm sorry.
It's fine.
That's why they're here.
But it will be posted too, just as all of our, you know, presentations are. So go ahead, flip the next one, Ms. Dobda. Okay, so, you know, I'll go straight down here. So we're talking about projected tax impact. So what's the debt service impact that Zach just went over? There's the 1.16 mils. So if you go back to my discussion about the long-term planning and us looking at other, you know, other operational variances and adding the high school, you know, talked about additional personnel that may be needed. You know, now if you don't see a big number on additional custodial maintenance supplies, and likely because we spend an awful lot of money on that old building. You know, and so, you know, with the newer systems and whatever, those, you know, some of those costs there would be, you know, will be in line with what we already have conservatively budgeted. But utilities calculation done by the architects and their team of experts that they did. And then transportation, like I said, this is just, I don't think we'll need it all, but we're putting it in there in case we need an everyday shuttle, you know, down to the field. And then obviously the building's gonna be valued at a lot more, so there will be a significant increase in our insurance premium, you know, relative to that, so we've tested the insurance market on that piece. And obviously, these are estimates and, you know, for that, but it gives you, you know, what the value, when you're looking at the value of our current mill, what that indirect cost impact would be, you know, 0.27 and a total millage impact of 1.43. You know, if you go back to, you know, the slides where we show you the progressive total taxation increase, you know, we're predicting our millage is gonna go up, you know, roughly 3.35 mils. You know, 1.43 of it is specifically relative to this, and that's that differential from 2% to 3.1%. You know, there is more of a tax increase for general operational needs and cost of living, you know, than there are for the project, but it obviously impacts it, and this is what that specific impact is. And if you go to the next page, Karen, you know, so just looking at what that median assessed homestead value in the schools, what an average taxpayer would pay relative to, you know, just this high school project, you know, that annual tax increase would be around $336, monthly tax increase 28. And as we said, we wanna, you know, we plan to phase that in. It won't be from day one, it'll be phased in over that 5-year period along with any other operational needs. Next slide. And this is just a chart, like I said, it'll all be posted, and we've done this before too, just because that's the median, but, you know, depending on what your, you know, home is assessed at, you can kind of do the math as to what the high school impact. Again, we will do more gyrations with total, we were focusing on specifically for the high school project, and this will align to that Act 34 hearing where we will reference all those indirect costs again. And, you know, Act 34 hearing, there will be a, you know, minimal compared to what we did today. We talked about financing alternatives and things like that. So we really wanted to get ahead of the action item and make sure that we were, tying that in. Next slide, Karen. You know, so, I mean, you know, I hope that, you know, our planning and can give the board some comfort. Listen, this is a major investment, you know, that does not come without cost. We are very well positioned to take that on, and yes, there is, like there is with any, you know, any project of this magnitude and impact, you know, unfortunately to the taxpayer to do it. Hope that we're being, you know, transparent and, you know, kind of ties in. I know you've seen a lot of this stuff and it kind of puts it all together again, you know, all in one place, and I think it'll be an easy thing for, you know, for the public, you know, to garner. But before I turn it over to questions, I'll turn it back to Mr. Waters for any final comments before you take questions.
I just want to echo your thanks to Zach, Tim, and Chris. This is, as the board knows, one element of a multi-element ecosystem of thought partners that we've engaged in this district for the past several years. I think it shows a degree of subject matter humility by those of us around the table, and even subject matter experts within the administration. I mean, there are limits to what we can do without the expertise of fully vetted, very capable, best-in-class thought partners, and these three represent just that in this realm. So, guys, thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for your ongoing support and service to the district. And suffice to say, we're going to need more of that in the months and years ahead. So we do appreciate it.